In this video, I'm going to show a simple automation scenario in Power Automation that uses two Excel files to cross-reference the data and also do some formatting using Office scripts. I'll start from the scratch and show the scenario end-to-end. For further details about Office scripts and the source code and files used in this video, please check out the description below. Now, the scenario that I'm using is very simple. I have two Excel files. One is called events, the other one is called event transactions. My goal is to compare the data that's in the event file. So I'm calling it sort of the key data or master data. And for the transaction, each of the transaction, I want to compare and make sure that the data here matches up with what's in the events file. The transaction file contains the first four columns you see here are identical to what's in the events file, but except that it has some additional columns like speaker information. But my goal is to format the cells where the data either is missing in the events file or for a given event, either the date or location or capacity doesn't match up. In addition, you'll notice that the date format used is slightly different compared to the events file and the event transaction files. And also the capacity is a little bit hard to read because it's justified to the right. So I want to fix those two formatting issues as part of the automation. So in order to do this end-to-end, I need two Office scripts. The first one is to extract the events information here. So mainly, each of the four columns that I want to verify, and then pass it to a second script. And the second script will use the extracted data from the events master file. And then for each of the transaction, it's going to cross-reference and then do the formatting that I mentioned. So I'm going to begin by extracting the data here using an Office scripts. So I'm going to launch the code editor. And because this is a scenario that only requires reading the data that's here, so I'm going to just start out with creating a new script. And I'm going to name this script as return unique I'm going to rename this as return unique events. Now, I'm going to start writing my script here. So you'll notice that the data that I need is in a worksheet called keys, and it is situated in a table. So knowing that information, so I'm going to first declare a table. And I'm going to get the worksheet named keys. And with my prior knowledge that hey, there's only one table here and I'm not going to have more than one table, a simple way to read what's in the table is just say get tables. It gives me a collection. So that means there could be multiple. But knowing that what I'm interested in is the first one, I'm going to get the first occurrence of the table. If you happen to know the actual table name, so you can also do get table and then use the key. Let's say this is called events table. So you could do that as well. And now, since I have the table information, what I'm interested in is the actual data that's located as part of the rows here. So in order to do that, I'm going to declare another variable called rows. So for the table that I declared, I'm going to get the range between header and total. So that means it's going to ignore the header row, and if there were any total rows, it's going to ignore that. And it's going to get just the range, underlying range object between the first row and the last row, ignoring the header. So once I do that, I'm going to get the values. So the range between header and total is it's a range. So within that range, I want the get values. So as you can see, I'm using the dot notation to chain the methods. So if you want to break this out into 2 separate rows, you can do that by simply defining, say, a range. And then you can also get let rows. And off of that range declared above, you can get the values. Or if you know the sequence of methods, you can chain them for convenience sake. Now that I have the actual values, I want to now create a structure that I can use to pass the information on to the next script. So in order to do that, I'll think about an object structure that I can use. So in order to do that, I'll create an interface. So interface is a way of creating a structure that you can use in your TypeScript, in the TypeScript. So I'm going to call it event data. So this is just declaring an interface that I can use later on in my script. And you'll notice that I'm defining the interface outside of the main function. So that way I can keep that separate and reuse that if I have multiple functions. So I'm gonna need the event ID. So I'm just gonna call it event. And I'll define this as a string. Next, I need the date. And now date is typically defined as a number. So there's an underlying number that is represented in the form of a date that you see here in Excel, but behind the scene, it is stored as a number. So I'm going to define that as a number. Next, I have the location. So location is a string, as you can see, and then the capacity. Capacity is a number. So so this represents the a single event, and then the data that I want to compare in the transaction. And I want to, as you can see, there are multiple events. So because of that, I'm going to need an array or a collection of these event data. So in order to create and return that, and so that I can use it in the next script, I'm going to create another holding array. I'm just going to call it records. So right now it is empty, so it doesn't have any data. Now, what I want to do is extract pieces of information from the values that I've read here in the rows and create individual objects in the form of this event data interface, and then include that in the records collection. So I'm going to traverse through each of the rows using for off loop. So I'm going to say for each of the rows data that I've extracted, I'm going to extract individual pieces of data. So I'm going to have the event, date, location, and capacity, because I know this happens to be in the same order. And since I don't need the registration amount, I'm just gonna simply ignore it for now. And so this destructuring in TypeScript allows you to read each of the columns in the row without having to use its index. So it's a convenient way of extracting data from an array. Now, now that I have this data, so I'm gonna push that into the empty collection that I created. So I'm going to push that. And since I want to use an object as an individual item, so I'm going to create an object using this the curly brace here. And I'm going to use the keys and each of these keys here. So event, I need the event which I'm extracting here as string. I'm gonna push date Now date as number, and the location as string, capacity. Now you might be wondering why I have this as string and as number, and that's because get values returns a type of any, and because we don't know the data type, so we have to tell the TypeScript that, hey, I know what I'm doing. Just pass this as a number. I know this column is going to have date, and this column is going to have number and capacity and date. The other ones are strings. So this is a way for telling TypeScript that, hey, I know the data type that I'm dealing with, and I'm gonna use that as a way to do type checking. Now, another way to ensure that you're using the right data types. So in order to ensure that you're passing the right data types over, so you could also say, hey, this records is a collection of event data. Right? And now imagine if I don't do this override, or do a different override. So let's say as a string. Now TypeScript is going to complain that, hey, look, date you're passing is a string, but I know it is not a string, it is a number, because over here in the interface I defined this as a number. So this is one way of verifying that you're passing the right data types over. So once I do that, now all I need to do is just return this. So return records. So another thing you'll need to do if you're returning anything is to actually define what exactly you're returning. So here again, I'm returning a collection of the event data type, event data interface. So this allows the TypeScript to verify that you're doing the right thing. So if I'm defining something else, let's say a string, TypeScript is going to complain that, hey, look, you're returning a string, whereas you're supposed to return a collection of event data. So this is another way to ensure that your script is doing the right thing. So I'm going to return the records. And for the purpose of testing, at the very end, I'm going to just console log to make sure that it's doing what it's supposed to do. So I'm going to use JSON stringify. So this is a built-in method that allows me to see the actual records in the form of a string. So I'm going to save this and run it. What I expect is about 7 rows of data, and for each row, for each instance in this array, I expect to see the corresponding data related to events. So when I run this, as you can see, I have the same set of events that I see in the spreadsheet. It's being returned, and the whole thing is enclosed in this square parenthesis. That means it's an array. And each of the line that you see here is a separate event, and it has the same key value pair as we have defined in this interface. So now using this, I can go to my next script and start to think about how do I actually use the data that's going to be passed here, and then do the validation. So so I'm done with my first script. For the second script, I'm going to switch over to the next Excel file here, so which is a transaction file. Now, at the beginning, I mentioned, hey, there are slightly different date formats, and then the capacity is not justified correctly. So because I have sort of write actions included here, I want to see how to actually do that. So one nice thing about Office scripts is that if you don't know which API to use for write actions, you can start to record it. So I'm going to begin the script by recording actions. So here, I'm going to right click and select this. Again, what you select doesn't matter. I might as well just do it on one and figure out what the syntax is. So I'm going to format to be the same date, the date type. So you here it'll say that, hey, I applied the number format for this, and this is the format that I wish to see. And over here, I want to justify this to the center, so that's good. I also want to figure out how to actually, color the cell with some color. So I'm going to pick some random color here. So let's say yellow. So okay, now I have 3 pieces of formatting actions that I need to construct. Again, I did that. I recorded on just one cell, or you can pick any range you want. But the point here is to generate the actual script that has the underlying write actions on which I can start now building my logic. So I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to rename this again to something more meaningful, names of format missing data. And then I'm going to edit this. So as you can see, Office scripts recorded what I need. Again, so here it's saying that, getting the range and setting number format to the format that I needed. And then this is how we actually center a cell data. So that's good. So this is how we actually fill a cell color. So that's good. So now I have these 3 pieces of information. So I'm going to keep this on the side. I'm going to think about the overall flow now, which is the script that I just wrote is going to give me the metadata needed for me to perform the validation. So what the way to define the input that your script is going to receive is to go to your main function and say that, hey, I'm going to get this data, and you can only receive string input. And because I'm going to use this in Power Automation only sends string from one script to another. So I'm going to pass in. I'm going to declare that saying, hey, this is string information. Right. So the first thing I need to do is look at again the data that I have, and the data is residing in a worksheet called transactions. It's in a separate table, and I'm going to use the same technique I used in the last script, which is first I'm going to define the table. So workbook get worksheet of transactions, which is this worksheet, and then I'm going to say, hey, get me all the tables. Use the auto completion. Now that I have all the tables, I know I'm going to only have one table, so I'm just going to use this nice little trick to get the first table. Now that I have the table, I first want to apply the formatting that we just applied for the date and then the capacity columns. So to do that, now given that for instance, the date only needs to be applied to the date column. The centering of the capacity only needs to be applied to the capacity column. One nice way of doing this is to use a table that you just defined, and then get column by name. And I know that the date header column name is date. And then I'm going to use the same method that I used in the past, which is get the range between header and total, because I don't want the same formatting to be applied to the header. So for that range, I'm now going to go back and look at how it was applied in my recorded script. So here I only applied to one cell, to B2, and I'm going to copy this. I'm going to apply it to the range that I'm selecting here. Right. So this is one way to record and reuse it elsewhere in the script. So now that I've used up this, I'm going to remove part of the recorded code because I've already taken that knowledge and applied elsewhere in the script. And line number 4, again, it is part of the recorded script. Since I don't need that, I've already figured out how to get the table that I need. Well, I'll keep it until I complete. So, all right, so just gonna separate it just so I know where the recorded script is. So, okay, now I've done this. I'm gonna do the kind of the same technique. I'm gonna copy the script, this line, and instead of date, I'm gonna do the capacity. And then I'm gonna get the range between header and total. And this time I need to center. So I'm gonna come back here and copy these 2 lines of code and copy it over here. So this gets the capacity column, gets the range between header and total, gets this formatting object and sets its horizontal alignment. And it's passing an enum as a parameter to this method. So that's great. So I don't really need to go anywhere to figure out how to do it. I'm just going to use the recorder and copy bits and pieces of data that I need. Okay, so now that I've done that, I also can now remove this because I've already used that up. Okay. So now that I've formatted the data, I'm going to get the same range that I need to use for doing the data validation. So I'm going to get the range that I'm interested in. I'm going to go back to the table, get the range, and I'm going to extract all of the rows. So I'm going to get the rows. And for the above range, I'm going to get the values. So values returns a 2-dimensional data representing the underlying range. As with the previous script, now I have to go through each of the rows and cross-reference the data with what was returned from the previous script and make sure that I highlight the actual values that are different from the master keys, master events data. So in order to do that, I need to now get the parse the keys data that's being sent into the script. Now, because this is a string, I need to convert that into an object, which is the same object that I'm passing, I'm returning from the script. So I'm going to use the same JSON object. I'm going to call it, let's say, keys object. So this is the object representation of the string value that you're getting. So I'm going to use the JSON parser. This is, again, an inbuilt function. I'm going to use the keys. I'm going to pass that. And then I'll go back to my previous script and then just copy the same interface data because we're going to use the same interface data even in this script. And as I'm parsing, I can tell TypeScript that, hey, what I'm going to get back is the event data array. So that way, TypeScript figures out that the keys object is an array of event data, and it helps me do code completion. And so I'm going to now loop through each of the rows and then use the keys object here for cross-reference purpose. Instead of for loop, I'm going to use the simple for loop here because I need the index data. So I'm going to say, hey, from 0 to length of the number of rows here, just increment I. Define a variable called row, and it's going to get the rows, the row that I'm on right now, which is represented by the index. And as with the previous script, I'm going to use array destructuring to extract pieces of data that I need. So what I'm doing here is knowing that it is in the right order, event, date, location, and capacity. I'm going to extract those 4 pieces of data. I'm not interested in the speaker column, so I'm not going to extract that. But let's imagine the speaker column happened to be in column B. In that case, you can simply tell TypeScript to ignore it by putting an empty space here, which means between here and here, I don't care about that that part of the data. So just get me the next column. So that's another way to say, give me only the set of columns that I'm interested from this array. Right? So now that I have the information that I'm looking for, the next lines of code is going to help me compare the data that I'm on, which is, let's say I'm on first row. I want to compare the event ID against the same event ID here, and then make sure that the dates match, locations match, and the capacity matches. If I don't find the event ID at all in the transaction, then I want to highlight that as well. So there are kind of 2 sets of mismatch you can get. One is where I have the event ID match, but one or many of the data here doesn't match the master event file, or it could be that the event itself is not going to match. So in the test data that I created, you can see that row number 16 here, E125X, that is not a valid event ID. So I want to just highlight that cell. But in other cases where maybe the event ID is present, but one of the information is not accurate, I'm going to highlight that as well. So that's the part of the logic. So and because for each row that I'm on, I'm going to have to parse through the data that's I'm going to traverse through the data that was sent here and then compare. There are many ways to do it. I'm going to use a very simple double loop structure. You can use some more advanced method, but this is much simpler to explain and code. So I'm going to start out with assuming that there is no match. Right, so I'm going to create a variable called match. I'm going to assign false. So that means that, hey, I don't even find the event match. Right now, for each of the key objects or event key objects that was passed from the other script, which is in the format of this, which means there's one event per each of the event here in the master file. So I'm going to traverse through each of that. So I'm going to say for each of the key object of key object, so that means for each event contained in the collection here, I want to check, hey, does the key object dot event, so I get the auto completion here because I define this to be a collection of the event data interface, and I've defined the interface in the same script. So this is a convenient way of getting the auto completion. So I'm going to check, hey, am I on the same the event object? That means the event ID matches. If the event ID match, so immediately I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to get the match. So I'm going to set the match variable to true, so that way I know that, okay, at least I have the event match. Now I want to compare each of the date, location, and capacity of the row that I'm on to the master event data. So I'm just going to do a simple comparison. If key objects date is not equal to the date that I'm on right now, and then I'm gonna color that cell. It's not data, it's date. Okay, so I'm gonna repeat that for two other columns. One is the location, and the next is capacity. So now what I want to do is, if they don't match, I want to color that cell with yellow color. Okay, so as you can see here, I recorded earlier on how to color a cell. So I'm going to use, so you can see here, it's doing that operation on a range. Now, because I only want to highlight the exact cell where the data is not going to match, I somehow need to get the cell that I'm on. So if this is a row that I'm on, I want, let's say if the location doesn't match, I want to somehow get only this location cell and not highlight any places where the data might be valid, right? So in order to do that, I'm going to use the overall range object that represents the entire set of rows. So off of that range object, I want to get a cell. So get cell is an API that takes the row on the column. So this is a sort of zero index based number that will help me narrow down to the column that I'm interested in. I already know which row I'm on because that's the kind of the variable that I is representing. I just need to know which column I'm on. So this requires some knowledge of what the actual how the columns themselves are located. So this is 0 and this is 1. So I'm going to use 1. So this gives me the cell. In Excel API, the cell and the range are basically the same objects. So I can reuse what I recorded here and simply copy that over here. So that means it's gonna format the color, the field color to yellow. So now that I've used all of this, I'm gonna just simply remove that. I don't need that anymore. Okay, so now that I've figured out how to do for one column, I'm just gonna simply repeat that and only change the column. So location is the second or the third column, or this index 2. Capacity is the fourth column, index 3. So this gives me pretty much what I need at this point. So given that if this for loop is going, it's going to take one event key data and then compare. If I've already found the match, I don't need to go any further, right? So I can simply break out of this. I can simply break out of this inner loop by using break statement. Okay. Right. So that means that I've traversed through all of I've done all the comparison. Now what I need to do is come back here and check, hey, did I actually find the event match itself? if I don't find the event match, now actually I need to highlight the very first cell of each of the row where I don't find the match. So I'm going to copy one of these statements. It's pretty much identical. So instead of I'm going to change the column number to 0 because that's where the event column is. Yeah, so and that's pretty much it. So this is achieving all the things that I need. And so for testing purpose, I can run this data as is right now, but you will see that I don't, like when I run this, the keys data is not going to have the value that the previous script is returning, because in Office scripts, when you run a script, it is only going to run in the context of this particular script and this particular workbook. It has no knowledge of the previous workbook or a previous script. The Power Automation is a place where you connect both, but in order for me to test it, I need to supply some sample data. You may recall that I used JSON Stringify to copy the data that I need. So I'm going to copy this from the output area. So this is basically the data that I need as an input into this. When you run this in Power Automation, you don't really need to do this, but only for testing purpose, I do need to supply this with some test data. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to override the data that comes in here in the form of keys. I'm going to just simply copy paste that here. So that means that so this is only needed for testing purpose. Override the keys data. Right? So now that I have this, I can go ahead and test it. So I'm going to put in some console log statements just so I know when at least when I'm testing, I'm getting some response as I expect. I'm going to save this before I run it. So for each of the event, I'm going to just simply display console log currently on event ID. And then over here, I'm going to say console log comparing event master event record of so when I use the console log inside a for loop, you see this sort of orange squiggly lines. It's complaining that, hey, invoking console log inside a for loop could slow down your performance. And I need to be aware of this, but since I'm only doing kind of testing at this point, I'm okay to have this. So this is going to help me identify any errors or debug, but I need to remember to remove this for the sake of end-to-end performance. Right? So now I'm going to run the script and let's see what happens. Save it and run it. Okay, so it did quite a lot of things. So I can kind of trace through what may have happened by just reading the console output. So it's saying that, hey, currently on event ID so and so. I could probably even do display the index. this may have been better, but anyway, you'll see that, so it's for each of the events, transaction data, it is comparing the master record. For the very first row, obviously, because E123 happened to be also the very first record on the master file, so it found a match. But on the future ones, you'll see that it actually goes through until it finds a match, right? So that's sort of just a snapshot of what actually happened in the form of the console log statements. But to verify, I need to really come here and see the data. So I can see that it has identified at least the event ID that didn't match, so that's good. And for the other types of data, you can spend more time kind of examining, comparing, but at a high level, I can show you that it's doing what it's supposed to do. For instance, E123 has a capacity of 10, whereas in the master record, right, capacity 10. So it shouldn't have highlighted that. Okay, so that may be a bug we need to fix. So let's look at the location, E126, Salt Lake City. So that should be Boise. So that's good. So location is working. Let's look at the event ID E124. Date of 3/7 is what it's saying. E124, it should be 3/2. So it's identifying the correct date mismatch and location mismatch, but looks like the capacity. Oh, okay. So I think I remember why this is the case, because I started out with formatting this. So I think it's retained the previous formatting that I had. So that's a bug that I need to fix. And then let's look at the capacity then, ignoring this because I know I already colored this cell. So E126 is 20. Here, E126 should be 25, right? So one way to kind of fix this is to, before I do anything, just format the range that I'm interested in, and simply reset all the format. So I can do that using sort of for each of the table. Let me move this range over here. So for the range that I'm dealing with here, I can say, get its, I think I can clear. I got to be careful using this because this can also clear the data. So this takes an enum, Excel script, clear apply to, and I got to make sure I click, select the formats. So I'm going to clear the formats, and then I'm going to rerun this. So this time I should basically get the same data except the very first capacity, since it matches, it should not highlight it. And I'm also seeing the row that I'm in. So if you are dealing with any bugs that are hard to detect, use knowing which row of the data you're comparing against. So that's helpful to have the row number. Okay, so I see that it's highlighting the right missing cells. You'll also notice that the date is now formatted correctly, and the capacity is also formatted to the right center alignment. So to check if it actually works correctly, so let's see, E126 should be 25 capacity, so I'm going to make it 25. And E126 should be Boise, so I'm going to change this to Boise. And then the date should be for E124, it should be that date. I'm just going to copy here. And let's see, so I'm going to change this date to maybe something different. So now it should highlight different set of cells because I modified the data. All right, so you can see that It's picking up the right mismatches, and if I fix the data, it's resetting the cell formatting, which is exactly what I want. You'll notice that slightly when I run this, you saw a little bit of lag between how each of the cells were formatted. And now if I go back to the two statements, and it's because those console log was kind of slowing my script down. Okay, so I'm going to save and I'm going to run. So this time it should run faster than the last time. You may not be able to notice that given I have very few set of data here, but in theory this will run much faster because I've removed all the console statements. Yeah, so you can see that there was just a small blink, but all the data was highlighted at once. So all right, so I think this script is almost done. At the very beginning I mentioned that maybe I want to email somebody that, hey, we found mismatches, please go review. If all the data is valid, then I don't really need to do that. So maybe I can generate like an email body that I can use in my Power Automation. So let's say in order to do that, I'm going to return a string. So I'm going to declare that, hey, my main function is going to return a string that I can use later on. Immediately TypeScript says, hey, wait a second, you're supposed to return a string. You're not returning it. So and I need to know, is there a match, or is there a complete match? That means there's no discrepancy of data, or is there at least sort of single mismatch that the user will need to actually go and review it? I can provide much more detailed set of information. For instance, hey, which event is which row here is needs review and so on. But because any user who comes in to validate or fixes can immediately see, all I need to tell them is, hey, there is something to go fix, or everything is okay. So I'm going to again use the same technique that I used for the match earlier. I'm going to create before I enter the loop, I'm going to create a variable. So let's say let overall match, that means everything match is true. So I'm going to assume that everything is in the right order. However, if I notice that in any of these, if I find any of the mismatch, I'm going to reset it. So the a mismatch can happen in one of these 4 columns. So I'm sure there are probably better ways to do this, but for now, knowing that there are only 4 places where the mismatch can occur, so I'm going to just place that in each of the comparison statements. So at the end, what I'm going to do is I'll say, if let's say, let return string is and if I have a single mismatch, I'm going to override that saying, all right, data requires your review, say mismatch. Data requires a review. Okay, so I'm going to just, before I return it, I'll just console log it. So this console log happens to be outside of any of the loops, so it is okay to use that here. Returning done. Save it. This time it should not complain that I'm not returning anything. So it was a small issue. Let me rerun. Okay, so it's font mismatch. Data requires a review. Whatever is coming out of the script can now then be used in another action in a flow. Okay, so now we've achieved 2 out of the 3 big things we need to achieve the end-to-end automation. One, there's one script that's returning the keys data, and the second script that is performing validation and highlighting the cells. The third thing I want to do is run it all in a Power Automation and then connect with a script, connect with an action that can actually send an email to somebody. Now, as I mentioned earlier, because now I'm going to connect all of this in Power Automation, I don't need to do an override of the test data here. So I can save it knowing that this keys information is going to be supplied by the previous script. And let's see how that is done. So I'm going to go to Power Automation. I'll create a flow. And you can set it to trigger based on whatever frequency you need or any condition. So for now, I'm just going to use sort of manually trigger this, right? So I'm going to call this compare, let's say validate. Event data, create. And I know I need to first do a run script action. I'm going to select the library, which is in my documents folder of OneDrive. The file that I'm interested in, the first one is the event file. So I'm going to pick that. And then the script that I need is return unique events. And what I want to do is pass that to the next script. Business OneDrive file is the event transactions. And I need the format missing data script. So I'm going to save this. And it's going to say, hey, you said that you need, you declared a variable called keys in your main function. Now, Power Automation is saying, hey, supply this information. So I'm going to say return. Oh, in the wrong place. So I'm going to use the result of the previous script as the input to the next script. So that is good. Next, I want to use an email. I'm going to send an email, and I have an email address here that I want to use. It's to this person, and let's say, event transaction validation result. Again, you can use more dynamic data, which means you can even likely change the subject, whatever information you need. But for now, I'm just going to use the static data here. Say, and here, use the body to use the result from the run script 2. I'm going to just save this. Okay, so this is pretty much what I need from an end-to-end flow standpoint. I'll go back here and remove the formatting just so I I can kind of figure out if my end-to-end script is running okay. I'm going to clear the formats. You'll see that when I clear format, the date format is also cleared, but that's okay. Since my script is formatting the date, when I run the end-to-end and flow, it should format all my columns correctly. All right, so I'm going to test this here. I'll perform the trigger action myself. So continue, run the flow. I can go back to here and see that it's running. Just gonna wait. Okay, so it completed and looks like it also sent an email saying that there's a mismatch. So if I go to my inbox, so you will see that I have the email, mismatch found, data requires your review. It's got the email subject. And the one cool thing about this is you can actually see what each script is sort of returning. So the run script, the output result is an array of each events. So this is still, as you can see, in the form of an object. By the time it comes to the run script, it's in the form of a string. So what it's outputting is the object. It's in another object called result. So that's what I'm using in my body as, hey, this is the actual output coming out of the previous script. Okay. So I think that concludes the end-to-end automation scenario where I use two Excel files. I use data from one Excel file to go back and verify the data across in the second workbook. I'm going to refresh and make sure it's formatted correctly, right? Yes. So I had to refresh here. Sometimes it shows the result directly, but at times you'll have to refresh to get the latest result coming out of Power Automation. All right, so it's highlighted all the cells correctly. I can fix this and rerun it. It'll do the right thing as we demonstrated during the testing of the second script. All right, so this concludes it. For further details about Office scripts, check out the description. I've also provided a link to the source code and all the files used. And if you have any questions, please leave a comment here. Let us know what you think. Thank you.